Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Fedora Council meeting. This is a sub-project report. We try and do these about once a month in a video conference. Most of our meetings in IRC are in IRC, but we do these kind of high bandwidth things live, often with some formal presentations, which we have this week. This week it is Modularity, which is one of our big initiatives in the project, and Langdon White is the project lead for that, or the objective lead for it. And we also have Adam Shamalik on the line here, who is one of the project people, and also Jan Kuzik, who's the program manager for Fedora. Some of the other Fedora Council members couldn't be here this week because of travel and other things, but this is being recorded, and there are slides which I'll put somewhere in a link somewhere in this video so people can find them. And with that, I will turn things over to Langdon, who is in the form of a screen share and can neither see us nor can we see him. But you know, that's how things go.
You can't see me either? Oh, that's kind of annoying.
Yeah, and just your slides.
Let me see if... Can I fix that? No, the camera's on.
No, you know, I think it's probably...
is what it is.
Yeah, it's make it worse.
Right, exactly.
Which you've done right now, by the way. Okay, there we go. Awesome.
That's my objective. All right, so let's get started. So Adam is here also for moral support and to correct me when I make mistakes. He also produced this first set of slides and corrected the next set of slides where I made stupid mistakes. So first thing we wanted to do was we kind of have continuous questions about what is modularity. And recently, Adam mostly came up with this set of slides to kind of try to explain what modularity is for. I would say it's not completely what we're doing with modularity, but it is kind of the most end user visible. So to get started, and hopefully nobody minds that we're going to do this like a little teaser, but tough luck. So what we want to do here is basically the goal is to give the right version to the end user of the things that they need. So we build modules, we ship artifacts, and users deploy what they like. How does that work? Well, okay, so we build modules. So today we kind of think about our source tree in terms of Fedora releases, which kind of begs the question of how does that follow any sort of upstream cadence? How do we allow for kind of lifecycle independence of Fedora from the components that it delivers? Well, this is where we have a little bit of a problem because everything is basically branched at, say, F26 or F27. And so that gets makes it very difficult to kind of say, well, I actually want version 2.2 of this web server versus 2.6 of this web server, when all we can do is say that we have the F26 version or the F27 version. So in the long run, so this is actually post F26, before F27, we would like to change how dist-git works so that things are actually managed on the kind of upstream cadence, or really, but it's still up to packagers, right? So it's whatever versions that they're interested in making available for consumption by Fedora end users. So there could be one version, there could be 30 versions. It's kind of whatever the packager or maintainer wants to manage. And generally speaking, I would recommend that most people would only want to manage one, maybe two of particularly popular things. You don't want to manage 30. But then we have this module MD, which is...
Hey, Langdon, can I interrupt your questions?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a provision for, let's say, I'm interested in the latest version of web server, 3.0, but other people are interested in web server, 2.2 or whatever?
That is a lovely segue. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So that's what I'm here for.
Exactly. So module MD, what that does is allows you to specify the combinations of things that you're interested in providing. So again, this is kind of at the packager level, except, the module creator level. Oh, you can't see my air quotes. But, a module creator is very much like a packager in that they decide what is best for their users in a sense. Now, any random user could create a module. This is where we have things like Copper, etc. Or, if they're good enough, if the modules are good enough, they could be accepted into Fedora main. But as, can you guys see my pointer?
Yes, I can see your pointer.
So for example, we have this web server 2.2 here, which says, okay, I've got 2.2 and I'm going to choose this other random library at version 4. Whereas this other module here is web server 2.6 and it's going to use library version 5. And then this database over here. And then maybe I have a developer stack over here, which actually chooses web server 2.6, library 5.0, and database 2.0. So that's exactly what you want to do, or what you were just describing, Matt, which is that, for arbitrary use cases, you can define which of the things over here you want to include in your kind of output component. Does that also answer your question?
Basically does.
Okay.
Well, I have some other questions, but I will save them for later. I will queue them up.
Okay. So now modules are great and all, but basically what we've defined over here is kind of a way to build binary blobs in a sense. What we're trying to do in order to make this stuff work, we need to kind of disconnect our packaging formats from the binaries that kind of create them, so that we can kind of develop or create and ship different packaging formats depending on the use case. So the two that we're mostly focused on right now are one we all know and love, which is RPMs, right? So that's a packaging format of these binaries that we decided are useful. And then the other one is as containers. So the packaging, and actually maybe a modification of this image should be to include RPM spec files kind of in here, much like Docker files are up here. And so a Docker file is essentially a spec file for a container. And so we can provide a Docker file or more than one Docker file, depending on what we want to do with this database over here. Just like we can have RPM packages or different RPM spec files, meta packages, etc. All the things we can do today around the packaging, but we can source that all off the same kind of construct of this module. So this developer stack could go out with a Docker file as a container, or it could go out with a bunch of spec files as RPM packages, or it could go out as both, but we don't need to modify what is in the module. We can continue to say this is a well-known module that is web server 2.6 and library 5.0 and database 2.0. It's just a packaging format that kind of comes out the other end of the machine, as it were. And then the end user can decide to consume which version of the things they may want to, or sorry, which packaging format they want to consume. It is likely for the near term that we will produce RPM packages for everything we build, and many container versions of the same thing, but there's no requirement that we do that, right? I mean, this goes back to policy within Fedora land. We could decide that some of these things are going to ship as RPMs and as Flatpaks, or as Flatpaks and Docker containers and RPM packages. Could be all of the above, or it could be just one of those types. Then we move on and we see, okay, so now the end user actually wants to consume these things. Well, the end user, and this is what we're talking about today, is Fedora 26, this Boltron server, which is kind of like a spin, but really kind of like a tech preview of how we're doing this this kind of build out of the modularized server. But you could also see, oh, sorry.
I had a question about the RPM thing a second ago. Mm-hmm. When things are built not as RPMs, are they still built from RPMs at this point? So
Docker containers are built from RPMs. That's why this is definitely a logical picture versus a kind of a physical picture. So at present, what actually happens is we build a bunch of RPMs, we stick them in an RPM repo, we point the Docker file at that RPM repo, and then we build a container from it. Yes.
So we're not yet getting at like packaging things in their native format or doing source to image directly.
Correct.
Kind of things. All right.
Not yet.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure that was very clear.
Yep. And it may be valuable, it may not be valuable. The point is we want the flexibility to make those decisions, right? But this is not a assessment of whether RPM is a good thing or a bad thing, as much as it is we know that there are other packaging formats that Fedora finds important, and we want to enable those other packaging formats and we want to kind of build them as efficiently as possible. Right now, building them efficiently means using RPMs because we know how to build those, we're good at it, and shoving those into containers. That doesn't mean that in the long term we might want to, kind of disconnect that, but it doesn't mean it's a good idea to disconnect it either. So, and we don't have to decide that anytime soon. So then kind of on the consumer side, sorry.
I just said awesome. Sounds great.
And then on the consumer side, you can kind of choose how you want to consume those things. Obviously, with Fedora Atomic, for example, you can't really choose RPMs. We do plan to do work around creating OS tree as another artifact output type, but that's not currently on our near-term roadmap. However, we're hoping the I don't know, what are they, the cloud working group, the atomic working group now? Maybe they can help us to work through that because it's got its own challenges. But present day, right, in an atomic client install, you wouldn't really be able to accept RPMs. You could only accept containers. OpenShift is in the same way, right? So if you had an OpenShift installation, you still might want to be able to choose Fedora containers to deploy on your OpenShift instance. And then our tech preview Boltron server, we want to enable basically being able to choose both. So you can kind of treat the Boltron server in a similar way to a traditional RPM-based distro, however, with more flexibility about what you choose to install. And then as far as versions are concerned, so having some latitude on what can be installed on it, rather than just the default version that is coming with Fedora, say, without the normal machinations of doing, say, compat libraries or something. But you could also choose to use those things as containers. And what we talk about pretty regularly is we'd like to enable like muscle memory, having the muscle memory kind of work with containers like it does with RPMs, except kind of really tell the end user what they're actually doing. So that because we believe that trying to completely mask how containers work is a very leaky abstraction, and so that's dangerous. So kind of like the yum DNF switch, right, or even the not sysvinit, but the switch to systemd, right, where it kind of said, hey, this old command that you're using, it works, but what we're actually doing is this over here, and you might want to investigate that stuff more. So kind of make it like an opt-in to take on these advanced features. And then we kind of have the overall view here, and this is another opportunity for questions, although we've had Matt stepping up to the plate. Any other questions on this part so far? The next set of slides is kind of where we're at. So,
yeah, I guess my main question here is, who is we in this? Is this the Modularity team, or is this Fedora in general? And we envision people who are Fedora packagers getting invested in being module packagers as well.
So right now, the Modularity Working Group is the we, in a sense. So we, in that sense, are doing kind of all of this work up until F26. But part of the F26 release is to try to put the processes in place, the guidelines in place, et cetera, so that we can kind of open it up to everybody. And that's a little bit in the next slides. So you could, as an individual, kind of come request to join the Modularity Working Group, or come to our meetings or whatever, and you can certainly start getting involved in this now. But both the Factory 2 team and our team, we don't feel like the infrastructure is in place to really support anybody doing it without kind of some level of hand-holding at this point.
Okay, but the goal is for it to be basically open to everybody in the project.
Yes, exactly. Come June, that's the goal.
June. Okay, that's nice and ambitious.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just the lead, so I can make all kinds of crazy statements.
Excellent.
All right, so that was those slides. Any other questions so far?
I have a couple technical questions.
Okay.
Is in dist-git, is this basically a new namespace in dist-git, or is this?
Is that in my other? Let me just see if it's in my other slides. There are actually a bunch of new namespaces in dist-git. Yeah, so it's actually in my other slides. So I'll get to that in a minute.
I'll hold my questions along those lines until you're all through the other slides then.
Okay. Any other unrelated things? All right, cool. So let me start the other ones. Technology is defeating me today. So just to kind of give you a little bit of where we've been, and if anybody's a supernatural TV watcher or the TV show Supernatural, hopefully you'll get this joke. We have a nice new logo. Thank you to mostly Adam, right? Maybe some help from Mo.
No, it was just me doing the crazy stuff.
Okay. So we have a very limited number of stickers as well. We will be making more. And so I just wanted to make sure I covered the important parts. Also, thanks to mostly Adam, we kind of took all of our wiki content and restructured it in terms of essentially it's a read the docs style website based on the content in the Modularity whatever you call it, Pagger repo. So hopefully this is a little more approachable, a little more understandable. There's a nice little video that you can't see here because it's cut off. It's below this part of the page. There's a nice little video introduction that's similar to the one I just gave. You know, and lots of docs. Please take a look. Please file bugs. You know, let us know what isn't understandable, what is missing, because it's hard for us being so kind of somewhat inwardly focused. We already know how this stuff works, so it's hard for us to sometimes recognize when we're not explaining it well to others. So,
what is the URL of that site?
It's right there at the bottom of the whatever this thing's called slide. So docs.pagger.org/modularity. You guys can see that, right?
I do not see that, but maybe I'm crazy.
It's covered with the video things.
Oh,
okay. That's annoying. All right, so it is at the very bottom. But it is docs.pagger.org/modularity.
Awesome.
All right, so general work complete. There's a content plan. It's currently like a spreadsheet. It's janky. It really needs to be a software solution for this. But we needed something, and so it's kind of something until we get probably changes to PDC to support kind of tracking our content. So what do I mean by a content plan? Basically, I mean the list of services to be provided by use case. So instead of just saying Apache HTTPD, we want to say an Apache based web server that is for production use versus say for development use. So we want to think about what the use case is, and we want to deliver things that are provide those use cases so that consumers can take them without having to worry about whether which use case they're actually trying to meet. So this is mostly to solve my personal hatred of every time I want to go and work on a website, I need to install a production server, then I need to break my firewall and SE Linux and everything else to make it so I can actually edit HTML files. A lot of the architecture stuff we've been working on, most of this has been relatively agile in the sense that we have been actually implementing, say, postfix and dovecoat to make sure that what we think is the right architecture is the right architecture. So we've kind of gone through a number of different things. There's 4 here, but there's probably another 10 where we're kind of doing creating all these things and then starting to document the how and basically there's a best practices guide in progress as well as kind of acceptance criteria. So in other words, when we don't consider a module in a container done until it kind of meets these acceptance criteria. And then we've also worked through deployment models for a single host. So what we want to do, kind of going back to that muscle memory thing, right, is that, so we ship a DNS server, say, as a container. We want to mount into that container all of the config files from the normal locations on the host. So that, kind of the operator of a single host can, find the, I can't remember the config file for a DNS server off the top of my head right this minute. But, that config file in the appropriate place in the etc directory so that it's there, but it's actually owned by the container. And we call that deployment model standalone versus, say, an orchestrated use case, which is something like an OpenShift type scenario. And we'd really like any of these containers we were producing to be, that the same image can actually be used both in the standalone scenario with a particular set of configuration and in the orchestrated scenario with a different set of configuration. And this seems, I think, a little heavy on the container focus, but that's because that's what we know the least about. Whereas with the RPM side of it, we know how to solve a lot more of those problems. And so it just hasn't been a big part of the focus lately. But we want to, the big place where that's not true is this kind of update model problem. So going back to our web server example from before, we had a 2.6 and a 2.2 and a 2.6. Well, let's say I install the 2.2 version of the web server. It is not legitimate necessarily to upgrade that to 2.6 just because a 2.6 is available. What we want to do is allow for the end user to follow particular streams. In other words, maybe they just want to take patches to the 2.2 version, and then they want to do kind of a planned upgrade to try to get to the 2.6 version. So basically, this is to try to help with...
We definitely do, because those different versions of that particular web server, branding aside, have completely different config file syntaxes. So everything,
for example, right, exactly, and that's very much the problem. So it's basically, this is to help people avoid having to cherry pick updates, right? So you go and look at the list of available updates and you say, well, I'm not taking that Apache one because I'm not ready for it yet because there might be a config file change. But that also means I'm not getting the CVE patches to it, right, or whatever. So, but basically what we want to do is allow the end user to, kind of pick when they do which kinds of upgrades. And for certain things, that might be on the X stream. On other things, it might be on the Y stream. On other things, might even be on the Z stream. Ruby's kind of notorious for that. So there's not a definitive answer to the right upgrade path. There's all of us who would like it to work in a particular way, and we keep beating upstream projects that they should work in a particular way, but they ignore everyone. So what we want to do is
developers for you, right?
Yeah, exactly. Speaking as a developer, this is so what we want to do is allow the module itself to dictate how upgrade paths work, right? So that you can kind of say, this one is a legitimate upgrade or an in-place upgrade in a sense versus that one, which is going to take more work.
As a sysadmin, if I have a Fedora server right now, I know that, in 13 months, the version that's available is going to be end of life. I need to upgrade. It might be fast. I might feel rushed, but at least I know what I'm getting. Mm-hmm. With this, how do I know when we've decided, okay, 2.2 is so old we're not maintaining it anymore? How do I know? Do I have to follow a end of life thing for each particular package I care about, or is there some sort of way to get a unified view of that?
So yes to both. So yes, every module will need to specify its kind of end of life plan, right, and update it as appropriate. But the flip side of that is what we would like to see is modifications to DNF such that you get unified views of that. So our goal, and I think we're not gonna see this out of the gate on F26. We're gonna see this kind of during the life cycle of F26 and F27, because basically we'll want to have the thing in place and then experiment with the user experience. So, but in my mind, right, what I envision is that something more like whatever it is, DNF check update. I have an alias, so I can't remember what the actual command is anymore. But basically, that it will make that information in a unified way about this particular system available. So, module X has CVE Y, right? Module K has an end of life within the next 3 months. You might want to think about upgrading. Module B has has a CVE fixed. You should upgrade this one. But it's a non-breaking change. So that you will see lots of other kinds of information related to the path you're on for a particular module, besides just, hey, there's a new version available.
Is anyone working on cockpit integration for that? Because that would be cool.
That's also on the hope list. But we have some commitments from the cockpit team to start to work on that. But they're The way Cockpit works is it quote unquote doesn't really do anything, right? In the sense that all it does is visualize functionality that exists in the tooling it's surfacing. So because we don't have that functionality on the client tooling yet, they can't do a visualization of it yet. So it's kind of a, we're kind of blocking them until we experiment some more with this UX. So, but in the near term, we want to see DNF do this directly. As soon as DNF can do it directly and we're satisfied with the kinds of information it's reporting, then we'll talk to the Cockpit team or even do ourselves, basically the JavaScript integration to visualize it in a Cockpit interface. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that seems completely fair.
Yeah. All right. So that's kind of what we've done so far. And now just to talk about F26. So actually, before I move on, we're finally at the point where we feel like all of the stuff that we need is starting to come together. And so as a result, we need a release that really proves that all the pieces work together, that we actually have content available, that content is manageable, and then someplace where our client tooling we can kind of start to experiment with. So that means build infrastructure. It means kind of the baseline component, which is the base runtime. It means the content itself, which is modules and containers. The client tooling, as I mentioned, the DNF stuff. We need testing because we can't manage any of this stuff without massive amounts of automated testing. And then documentation, to Matt, your earlier point of how do we engage everyone else in this, how do we allow everyone else to contribute to this as well? So moving into it, there's a lot of text here. I won't go over it too much, but to your earlier question, Matt, yes, there are new namespaces in Dискit. So there's one for modules, which I can never remember if it's called module or modules, but that's where your module MD files go. So the YAML configuration file that indicates what's in a module. Docker, which I'm petitioning to get that changed to be container, because right now that's awfully limiting. We have lots of other different container types that we'd like to start to consider that isn't just Docker. And then we have the test namespaces. I know test RPMs and whether the tests go directly in the RPM namespace is under some contention. We think we'll probably still have test modules and test Docker as separate namespaces for tests. That is being worked out right now, so don't take this as necessarily gospel. This is what we think it's going to look like, but perhaps not. But it's going to be pretty similar. The point is here, though, that those RPMs and modules kind of get pulled into MBS, which is the module build service, which essentially wraps Koji and builds. It actually still builds RPMs through Koji. It just, because now you have to build lots of different kinds of RPMs as kind of one unit. It pulls them together as a module, and sometimes we'll have to do multiple Koji builds to actually get the repo that we need that is the module at the end. OSBS pulls from OSBS is the OpenShift build service, but really what it is, it's a Docker container build service in the Fedora infrastructure, and so. Right now, we don't have great orchestration between MBS and OSBS, so you still have to kind of on the client side, okay, go build this module. Now, okay, go build the container based on that module. So we're still working on some of that automation. Again, something that we'll probably see post F26, but that's the long-term goal, is that's more of an automatic infrastructure. The Fedora CI, a lot of that is in place. So now we're trying to integrate tests, which is always the important part of CI, as well as some generic tests. So, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But the Fedora CI here is at this point really just automated testing. We would like to see a transition to proper CI. So in other words, changes are gated. So basically on commit tests are done immediately, or pull requests even are gated by testing. but that's not something we'll have for F26, but we will be gating content going out to the mirrors, the OCI registry through automated testing at least. So not quite true CI, but close.
Validation testing, basically, automated validation.
Exactly. And because it's all Fed message based, we should be able to move that around inside the kind of order of operations relatively easily once we're satisfied that it's working. So that's the build infrastructure. This is mostly the Factory 2 team under Ralph Bean. But the reason the Modularity team cares about this is because we can't really do anything until all of this stuff is in place. And it has come online, and I think we've had our first base runtime build as of last Friday. So hopefully we'll be getting some proper module builds this week, is my hope.
Cool.
What will not be available for F26 is... I mentioned the CI stuff already. How a big, huge thing that we'll be missing is there will be no updates. So one of the aspects of the build infrastructure that we haven't leveraged yet is, or haven't worked on yet too much, is how do we actually update this content so that we can, kind of go through Bodhi and all that stuff. So basically, we haven't focused on any of that so far. I think we will be able to cheat as far as updates are concerned. In other words, like, we could do updates via just destroying everything, right, and rebuilding it. That's an update in a sense. Another way is if we're using containers, right, we can rebuild the containers, and those go down a different release stream anyway. So we actually do have ways I think we'll be able to do updates, but this is why it is a preview release. It should not be run in anything like production. I'm not even sure I would recommend running it on your laptop. But at least it'll give us something to play with. Again, related to the lack of updates, we won't be able to have, or we're not going to really have a way to report bugs about this stuff. What we do have to figure out between now and release date is how people should provide feedback. So that will be done somehow. But actually filing bugs related to actual content being buggy, we're not really going to support that yet because, again, that's related to we need to kind of restructure Bugzilla, or at least think about how we want to restructure Bugzilla so that you can, as the end user, you think about this thing that you have, right? You have a web server and you want to file a bug against, or a development kit, right? You want to file a bug against that. You don't know which aspect inside there is what's actually causing the bug. So we need to think about how to allow end users to file bugs, and for it to make sense both to the end user, but then actually get back to the appropriate person to respond to that bug. The other thing that
Fedora product in the Bugzilla sense, that's for modular Fedora or Fedora modules or something like that.
Right. That's what we have to think through. Just speaking from the Red Hat Software Collections experience, that's kind of what they tried in Bugzilla for that product, and it hasn't been great. It's been kind of painful. Fundamentally, Bugzilla thinks about these things, like the way we use Bugzilla is almost fundamentally at odds with the way you want to think about modules. It's a hard problem.
Bugzilla is a fine problem tracking tool for developers themselves, but it does not work really well for end user problem reporting. Help wanted, general Fedora world. Right.
So that's why we need to think through it. That's why we're not pushing hard for it to be ready for F26. It is something we want to solve. We don't think we can do it by F26. All right. So the other thing that I personally think is our biggest risk is that the branching changes that we wanted will not be available for F26. So we'll have to simulate having Web Server 2.2 versus Web Server 2.6 by using essentially F26 and Rawhide or something. I think we're going to, as we get closer to release date, we'll be able to think about that some more, or maybe we'll be able to do some small amount of branching for certain things just for experimentation. But I really had hoped this would make it, but it does not appear like it's going to.
I have some questions about this one. Is this going to be changing the branching in the existing RPM namespace in dist-git, or is this changing branching in the modules namespace?
The goal is to change the branching in the RPM dist-git.
Okay, so that will affect lots of people, obviously.
Right.
Is that changing the branching for packages that go into modules or for all packages?
Well, so there's a difference between changing and make available, right? So in other words, what like I don't imagine that there would stop being an F26 and an F27 and even an F28 branch for a particular RPM if the package maintainer so desires. What I want to allow them to also do is have another branch that is 2.2 and 2.6. So, there's nothing saying that we have to have only one type of branch in there. It will be a little confusing for a while, but it's more like the addition of a type of branch that would be available.
Yeah,
but that's part of why it's not done yet, is because that's one of the things we got to.
It seems like it could potentially all of a sudden now, instead of having to maintain current and one other one, I now have to maintain lots of different ones possibly.
Right. But only if you want to make them available. And I think this is where some of the organizational structure stuff comes in too.
Yeah, like what happens in the case of your library 4, library 5 in your web server module? So I say I'm the maintainer of web server 2.6, I'm the maintainer of the older one, web server 2.2, and I rely on library 4. But I'm not the maintainer of library 4. That's just a dependency. Do I have to, if I want, say the library maintainer then doesn't want anything to do with modules, they just want to keep updating to the latest version like they've always done. How do I get my library 4?
So this is where I was kind of saying, like, some of the organizational processes may need to change, right? In the sense that there are a couple things you can do. You can either follow them and keep relying on this other packager to maintain their stuff, and you just have to keep up to date with them. Okay, that's your first choice. Your second choice is you have access rights, quote unquote, whatever that means, to the library 4 version in the same dist-git namespace. So now you have elected to become the maintainer for library version 4.
Right. So we've got control for that basically
for everybody else, right? So, or you can elect to pull that library into your namespace, right, directly.
So you would actually literally bundle that into your RPM, or would you actually put multiple spec files into your own namespace?
More the latter. So the end experience is bundling, in the sense that you have multiple kind of versions of things potentially, but for maintainability, no, they should still be separated. As you said, right, is that you kind of have like multiple spec files in your
that makes sense from a maintainability, from that logical maintainability point of view of the module, but is a very different infrastructure change. The thing where you just have you're the maintainer of library 4, that branch under of library. We basically already have the workflow for that in PackageDB, but the idea of having more than one spec file in one repo is new. Not necessarily bad, but would require a lot of changing of things, I think.
Yeah, so that's, but basically you're hitting on why this stuff isn't there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, so that's that. I'm going to move on. All right, so base runtime is basically a very special module in that this is kind of the base for all the things. So meant to be incredibly small. It's meant to be kind of very easy, or as easy as possible to maintain, so that we can actually have potentially longer lifespans on base runtime than we do for traditional Fedora releases, or shorter, for that matter. So basically what base runtime is your API in a sense into the hardware. So it would include, kernel, glibc, that kind of stuff. But it has its own internal kind of demarcations, so that things like a kernel could theoretically be swapped underneath that API, so that it can kind of continue to maintain its public API, so the glibc side of it, while potentially modifying things underneath it, so that we can kind of continue to track hardware or whatever. The same module is meant to have multiple what we call install profiles. So an install profile is, how does it lay down on disk? So even though there's a whole bunch of, say, RPMs available in the base runtime module, they're not all provided in any given installation. So in other words, the Docker base image that is a particular install profile from the base runtime doesn't include the kernel, right? Whereas a QEMU image does include the kernel, but Bimby doesn't include something else, right? So all of the components are available and maintained at the module level, and then any given install profile defines what is default, what is provided in the actual install. There's also,
will there be a hardware install profile at some point?
what is a hardware install profile?
So QEMU image means to install into virtualization, right?
Yeah.
And Docker.
Oh, you mean like an ISO?
No, well, yeah. Basically, something meant to install on bare metal.
Yeah. We don't know if we can hit it for F26. We're actually still trying, but we're not sure we can actually make it. But yeah, that's the idea.
Josh Boyer has just joined the video call. Hello, Josh.
Hello, Josh.
He's on mute. He's probably just going to sit there in the background. Let's
right.
keep going.
Okay. Also, really, with base runtime, a bunch of automated tests and ensure that it actually does what it does, and then a static build route that other things can take advantage of as well. And some of the build route stuff we're still working through about, like, if you have any given module, where do you get the build route from? Do you get the build route that is the exact same thing as base runtime? What if you need extra stuff? How do you describe that, etc.? So some of that we're still working through, but that's the idea. So that's base runtime. Like I said, built our first one, I think it was last Friday, and there are some problems, I think, for multi-arc. So that hopefully will be fixed this week, is what I understand. So we should have a complete base runtime for multi-arc by the end of the week. But it's probably not as refined as we would like. So, essentially it's got some stuff in it that we don't think we actually need. But we kind of want to just set a line in the sand and go for now, and then refine it later.
So this will also answer the question of who owns the Docker base image, because that's ended up getting kicked around between groups in Fedora for a while and not getting as much love as it needs.
Yeah, my supposition here is base runtime module owns the Docker base image. Period. End of story. But we can see what happens. All right, modules and containers. A number of modules exercising various use cases. And so the various use cases are kind of like a platform service or an optional service, applications, languages, frameworks, that kind of stuff, so that we can kind of exercise all the different use cases. We're currently calling them standalone containers as containers, but as you note, there's a little star there because there is consternation over whether that's a good industry term or not, which kind of made it up, but apparently there's already some terms for this stuff that already are kind of accepted in the wild, so we'd rather follow their terminology than making up new stuff, but that just we need to finish ironing that out.
That sounds reasonable. What are some of those other terms?
The reason we don't know is because I haven't read the doc that somebody wrote about that. Awesome. So I don't know. I basically all the terms that I've heard floating around don't actually describe this, so that's why I'm a little leery about the answer to that question. But I could just be wrong, which is certainly commonly possible. So, and then automated tests, also, the things will be in the various namespaces, et cetera. But this is what we kind of want to deliver for Boltron. And some of it, the nice thing is about some of it is it can land in a sense after the initial release, particularly things that are in containers, right? As long as they just show up in the registry, they become available, right? So we're less locked to the actual Fedora schedule. All right, and here is the punch list of things that we expect to do by F26. Committed is we are definitely doing this. So container runtime module is worth mentioning. So we keep talking about using a bunch of containers. Well, we need a module that will actually run those containers. Likely this will just be Docker at this point. We may get lucky and be able to provide one or two other runtimes as well, but we don't know yet. Basically, it's time. DNF full version base runtime is currently using micro DNF. So we need a way to actually provide actual DNF, unless micro DNF manages to do all the things by F26, which I find unlikely. So we need a way to still install actual DNF. Shared user space module. So this is I sometimes refer to this as the everything else module, or the the messy module, or whatever. But this is basically the layer of things that are kind of between applications and base runtime. And right now we suspect that that is going to be fairly big. So basically it's all the things that we can't actually separate out into applications. So random weird ones that come up that have to go in here for various reasons. So one of the examples is ImageMagick. ImageMagick is currently packaged with the binary and the library both in the same package. We don't think between now and F26 we can repackage it, but because they are bundled together, that means that we can't install two different versions of that library next to each other because the binaries conflict. Sorry, the executables conflict. They're both binaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So is it possible that we would eventually have maybe something like a version of ImageMagick, maybe latest or whatever happens to be in the shared user space module, and then also if people care about ImageMagick versions in particular, separate modules for those? Could things both be in the shared user space and not, or is it one or the other?
We can't do that for ImageMagick because of how it's packaged, which I don't think is the question you're asking, but I wanted to answer that anyway. To the question I think you're asking, which is that I have library X in shared user space of version Y. Can I offer can I use library X of version K in some other application? Yes, that's the idea.
I don't quite understand why, if this is going in a container, is the shared user space mandatory, or why does conflict keep me from having a separate module for it if I don't care if it conflicts with this shared user space?
Because this also covers the RPM use case, not just containers.
Okay. And so will this include everything that happens to not be packaged as an application, or things that we know can't be packaged as an application?
I would actually say, like, in the perfect world, this is the stuff that this is the stuff that Fedora wants to offer as its quote unquote platform. So in other words, it's libxml, right? It's like everybody uses it. There's no really good reason to maintain multiple versions of it. So why don't we just stick it in there, and we're going to call that the shared user space. You should not use a different version of it in your application. You should just use that one. You could, but that's your own problem. Go do it and be sick and ill and twisted, or whatever.
So practically speaking, this is going to be something that is going to be constructed intentionally. It's not going to be, we're going to put everything, like a kitchen sink, everything we didn't put anywhere else goes here automatically.
Right. So for Throwback Wednesday, this is ring 1.
Right. So NetHack does not go into here just because nobody has packaged NetHack separately.
Right. So it might in the early stage, because we, basically we're going to shove everything we're going to shove all the things that we think belong in there, and then also the things that we can't figure out how to get out of there, in the near term, with basically text that says this, this belongs here and this thing really doesn't, but we can't figure out a way to get it out yet.
That would be if NetHack happens to be the build dependency of something that we don't.
Which would not surprise me in the slightest.
Right. Me either.
All right. So the committed list here. So that was all the ones I really wanted to kind of talk about. Committed here, it means, we're definitely going to have these. Targeted, we think it's likely we're going to have these. And proposed, maybe if we get lucky.
It's a pretty ambitious list. That seems pretty awesome.
Yeah. Luckily, we're stealing a lot of it from other people, because, like, at the end of the day, making a module or a container out of those modules is actually not a whole lot of work if the things are kind of well packaged and available and that kind of stuff. The hardest parts are figuring out when you RPM when you DNF install bind, which of those two DNF server use cases do you actually get, right? So it's figuring out that kind of stuff. It's what kind of use cases people actually think are useful, that kind of stuff. It's kind of cleaning up things like Docker files to make sure that they are, kind of following best practices. So the module MD itself, for example, we're already starting to have tools that generate them based on RPM depths. So hopefully, it'll actually get even faster post F26, that we can just kind of convert everything and it'll be simple, at least the rudimentary versions. So, all right, moving on. We're almost out of time. We have 2 minutes before my next meeting. Client tooling, as I kind of talked about a bunch already, we want to get some versions of DNF out there with potentially some different kind of variants on it, so that we can kind of experiment with how it works. We'd actually like to do a Fedora test day to gather feedback on it. We're proposing like other methods of trying to get more feedback. But basically, we think the user experience of interacting with all this stuff is one of our biggest risks, and we don't believe we can design it in a vacuum. We think we need to kind of actually put it in front of people and try it. If anyone was at my demo at Flock last year, that was very pronounced, right? It even while I was giving the talk, I was finding problems with the user experience. So we really need to work through that. And it's been really hard to do that without the infrastructure in place and everything else to actually give you the content to experiment.
Hopefully your next presentation will be much less embarrassing.
It wasn't embarrassing. It was good. I thought it was awesome.
It was great.
So let's see. So these are the general tests. Basically we have a bunch of kind of guidelines and stuff, very similar to like the FBC guidelines. We would like as much as possible, the guidelines to actually be implemented as full-on tests so that they're automatically tested to be meeting the guidelines. And we're getting there. I wouldn't say, it's certainly not solved, but we should be able to get a lot of it. Then there's also this libabigail thing where, one of the things that's really important with modules is we need to be able to track change to API, right? So that we can provably say that this 2.2.3 version of the thing, if you upgraded 2.2.4, none of your stuff will break. And libabigail can help us do that. So we'd like to implement that. I would say that's pretty ambitious for F26. I'm not sure what.
How are the first two of these things on the F26 committed, proposed, stretch goal?
The first two, there's actually already implementations. They're just not great. The last one, I would say, is probably a stretch goal.
Okay.
The first two are really at like quality level, like how much they do versus.
If someone wants to get involved in improving these, how would they do that?
Come to the Modularity Working Group meeting. We're just laying in how they're going to actually get executed. So we actually have the code that does the tests. We don't have them automated into the infrastructure yet because that stuff's just coming in. But literally, that is a topic of discussion in the working group. Like it was this week and will be at the next one, which is in 2 weeks. Documentation and miscellaneous. we need changes to SE Linux and how that gets delivered, module creation guidelines, you know, how to become a module creator, basically all the things you were kind of asking for before. But yeah, a lot of that stuff needs to kind of drop in, as well as processes for review. The infrastructure guys are like not interested in opening up module creation to everyone if there's no review processes in place, for example. Right.
On your last point, does that mean Voltron is shipping with SE Linux set in force 0?
No, SE, it'll be more like we're going to have a monster amount of SE Linux policy that is not applicable to the content we have. So way more SE Linux policy than is needed is my suspicion. But we've been working with the SE Linux guys to figure out how to do, because basically the problem is right now the way SE Linux works, right? It basically ships the whole blob of all the policy for everything kind of all at once. With modularity, we need it to be aggregatable. And they're working on that, but we're not sure it'll be ready in time.
Okay.
That's it.
All right. No time for questions, I guess. You need to go get a Kleenex, I think. You've been sniffling quite a lot.
No.
No?
I'm just kidding. Maybe. I don't. Did I turn off sharing? I don't know if I did or not.
You're back on the visible.
No. It might be allergies.
Yeah, and I guess we'll do questions on the mailing lists and whatever. People are interested, come to the Modularity Working Group meetings. Langdon, when are those?
They're on Fedora, so you can always track them there, but they are on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern. No, 10 a.m. Eastern. Yeah.
Daylight saving time. So that's what?
Yeah, I know. I'm all confused right now.
1400 UTC.
Yeah. But they are every other week. We have office hours the alternate week. So, you know, if you just have random questions, whatever, the office hours are great. If you want the more structured conversation, they are, you know, every 2 weeks. Yeah. So 11 a.m. on Tuesdays, once the time zones are less confusing.
Okay. Thank you, Langdon. Thanks, Adam, for showing up, even if we didn't make you talk. See everybody on IRC and mailing lists, and back here in video next month. It's either going to be Fedora Marketing or Fedora Diversity, depending on who says they have their presentation ready first. So, bye, everybody.